Do you remember feeding a kid in 1999? The question hit her like a fist to the chest. Helen Calloway stood frozen behind her counter flower on her hands, coffee going cold, while 178 motorcycles shook the glass off her pastry case. And a man built like a wall looked at her like she was the only person on earth who could answer him. She had not heard that year spoken out loud in a very long time. She had not let herself. Because 1999 was the year a bruised, half-starved boy stumbled through her door and disappeared 2 weeks later. And she never stopped wondering if she had saved him or lost him forever. But before we get to the motorcycles, before we get to the man in the question, and the 178 engines idling on Archer Street in Ridgemont, Pennsylvania, on a Tuesday morning in October, we need to go back to the beginning of everything, back to a time when Helen Calloway was not yet the woman standing behind that counter. Back to when she was someone else, entirely standing beside a man who believed the world was kinder than it had any right to be, and who made her believe it too, at least for a while. The year was 1993. Helen was 30 years old, and the world had not been particularly generous with her up to that point. She had grown up in Scranton in a house that smelled like cigarette smoke, and something sour that she could never quite identify, but that she later understood was the smell of people who had stopped trying. Her father drove a delivery truck until his back gave out, and then he drove nothing at all. Just sat in the recliner in the front room with the television on and a look on his face like the world owed him something it was never going to pay. Her mother worked the register at a grocery store 6 days a week and came home with the particular kind of exhaustion that lives in the shoulders and never fully leaves. There were bills on the kitchen counter that no one opened. There were phone calls in the evening that her mother answered in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, turning away from the children, as though the act of turning made the conversation invisible. Helen learned young that money was not simply something you had or did not have. It was a weather system. It moved through the house in cold fronts and sudden squalls, and you learned to read it the way farmers read the sky by instinct, by the tightening in your mother's jaw, by the silence that followed the sound of an envelope being opened. Helen was the middle child of three, the invisible one, the one who learned early that the surest way to survive a house like that was to become useful and then become quiet. She cooked dinner from the age of 11. She cleaned bathrooms that were not hers to clean. She learned to fold laundry with such precision that the edges lined up like pages in a book, because once, just once, her father had thrown an entire basket of clothes across the kitchen because the towels were uneven, and she had decided in that moment that she would never give anyone a reason to throw anything again. Her older brother left home at 17 and did not come back. Her younger sister stayed and became their mother, not in role, but in posture, absorbing the same tired slump, the same defeated quiet, the same habit of answering the phone in a whisper. Helen watched this happen and made a private vow, not spoken aloud, not written down, just a thing she carried in the center of herself, like a stone, that she would not become either of them. She would not run and she would not stay. She would build something. She did not yet know what. She was 16 when the thing happened that she would carry for the rest of her life, though she did not understand its full weight until decades later. It was February, the kind of February that Scranton does best, gray and biting and relentless, the kind that makes you understand why people invented the word bleak. Helen had been walking home from school a 3-mile stretch through neighborhoods that got progressively worse, the closer she got to her own, and she had stopped at a diner on Lackawanna Avenue because she was cold and because she had 60 cents in her pocket and because sometimes a person just needs to sit somewhere warm for 10 minutes before they can face the rest of it. She sat at the counter. She ordered a cup of coffee with her 60 cents, which was not really enough for a cup of coffee, but the man at the register looked at her and charged her 60 cents anyway, which was its own small kindness, though she did not recognize it as such at the time. And she sat there with both hands wrapped around the mug, feeling the heat seep into her fingers, and she did not realize she was crying until the woman behind the counter set down a plate of food in front of her that she had not ordered and could not pay for. Grilled cheese and tomato soup. The simplest thing, the most ordinary thing. Helen looked up. The woman was maybe 50, with hands that were red and rough from work and eyes that were brown and steady and completely without judgment. She did not say anything about the crying. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not tilt her head to one side and make the sympathetic face that people make When they want you to know they feel bad for you, which is a face Helen had already learned to recognize and resent because it asked something of her. It asked her to perform gratitude or vulnerability or some other things she did not have the energy to perform. This woman did none of that. She just set the plate down and said, "Eat, honey. You look like you need it." Helen ate. She ate every bite, and when she was done, she reached for her 60 cents and the woman shook her head and said, "That one is on the house. You come back whenever you need to." Helen never went back. She could not explain why. Something about the kindness of it was too large to hold, and she was not yet a person who knew how to hold large things. She was a person who folded towels with surgical precision so that no one would throw anything. She was not equipped for generosity, not yet, but she carried it. She carried it the way you carry a seed in your pocket without knowing what it will grow into. She carried it through the rest of high school, through 2 years of community college, through a series of waitressing jobs that blurred together like bad watercolors, through a short and spectacularly ill-advised relationship with a man named Dale, who had a nice smile and a drinking problem, and the particular talent for making a woman feel like the most important person in the room right up until he made her feel like the least. She left Dale on a Tuesday morning while he was still sleeping. She packed one bag. She did not leave a note. She drove south for 2 hours and ended up in Ridgemont, Pennsylvania, which was not a destination she had chosen so much as a place where the car decided to stop, and she took it as a sign which was unlike her because Helen Calloway did not generally believe in signs. She believed in work and caution and the particular arithmetic of survival that she had learned in a house full of unopened bills. But the car stopped, and so did she. She got a job waitressing at a place on Main Street. She rented a room above a hardware store. She saved money with the grim efficiency of a woman who knew exactly what it felt like to not have any. And she carried that seed, that grilled cheese and tomato soup, that act of unrequested kindness from a woman whose name she never learned. And she waited without knowing she was waiting for the moment when she would understand what it was for. She carried it all the way to a small restaurant supply store in Ridgemont, Pennsylvania in the spring of 1991, where she was pricing commercial mixers she could not afford because she had gotten it into her head that she was going to open a bakery, which was either the bravest thing she had ever decided or the stupidest, and she had not yet determined which. That was where she met Bobby Calloway. He was behind the counter, tall, a little soft around the middle, in the way of a man who tasted everything he baked and did not apologize for it. Brown hair going early to gray at the temples, hands that were large and capable, and dusted with something that might have been flour or might have been powdered sugar and turned out to be both. He was explaining the difference between a planetary mixer and a spiral mixer to a woman who clearly did not care. And he was doing it with such genuine enthusiasm that Helen stopped in the aisle and watched him the way you watch someone who is doing a thing they love, which is one of the most attractive things a person can do, though most people do not know it until they see it. He caught her watching. He smiled. It was not a calculated smile. It was the smile of a man who smiled easily and often, and whose face had been built for exactly that purpose. There were lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, not from age but from repetition, the face of a man who had spent his life finding things worth smiling at. "Can I help you find something?" he said. Everything, she thought. "A mixer," she said. They talked for 45 minutes. Then they talked for another 45 minutes over coffee at the shop across the street. Then they talked every day for the next 3 weeks on the phone at the supply store at the diner on Archer Street, where Bobby took her for their first official dinner and ordered cinnamon rolls for dessert because he said he had been working on the recipe for 6 years, and the diner's version was the only one in town that came close to what he was trying to achieve. He told her about the recipe. He told her about it the way other men talked about Mers or sports or the stock market, with a passion that was so specific and so deep that it made her feel like she was being led into a room that most people never saw. The cinnamon had to be Ceylon, not cassia. The butter had to be European-style, higher fat content. The dough had to rest overnight, minimum 12 hours, because the slow fermentation was what gave it the texture, the particular chewiness that made people close their eyes when they bit into it. She asked him why he worked at a supply store instead of opening his own bakery. He got quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I have been waiting for the right person to do it with." He was looking at her when he said it, not in a way that was aggressive or presumptuous, in a way that was simply honest. The way a person looks at you when they are telling you the truest thing they know, and they are not afraid of it, which is a kind of courage that Helen had never encountered in a man before. The men she had known, her father Dale, the various employers and landlords and strangers who had populated her life up to that point, had all been men who hid. They hid behind anger or charm or authority or alcohol or the particular kind of silence that is not peaceful but evasive. Bobby Calloway did not hide. He stood in the open and said true things and waited to see what would happen. What happened was Helen. They were married in the fall of 1992 in a courthouse ceremony with 4 witnesses and no flowers because they had spent the flower budget on a commercial oven. Bobby said the oven was more romantic anyway. Helen did not disagree. She wore a blue dress she had found at a thrift store in the next town, and Bobby wore the only suit he owned, which was slightly too large in the shoulders, and they stood in front of a judge who looked like he had done this 1,000 times, and Bobby held her hands and said vows that he had written himself, which were not poetic or elegant, but were true, and the trueness of them was better than any poetry she had ever read. I am going to show up, he said, every morning. That is what I am going to do. I am going to show up, and I am going to try, and I am going to believe that this is going to work, even when it does not feel like it is working. And I am going to believe in you, even when you do not believe in yourself, especially then. She had not cried. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she had held his hands very tightly. They opened the bakery in June of 1993. Bobby signed the lease 2 weeks before the bank approved their loan because he told Helen when she panicked, signing the lease was an act of faith and the bank would follow the faith, not the other way around. The bank came through 5 days later. Bobby had been right. He was right about most things in that particular way that used to infuriate Helen and comfort her in equal measure. Not because he was smug about it. He was never smug. He was simply a man who believed in things with such conviction that the things had a tendency to believe back. The bakery was small. 12 tables, a glass display case, a kitchen in the back that was barely large enough for 2 people to work in without colliding, which meant they collided constantly, which meant they spent most of their early mornings laughing and bumping elbows and covered in flour and happier than either of them had any right to be. Bobby made the cinnamon rolls. That was the thing. That was the anchor. Everything else on the menu was fine. The croissants were good. The sourdough was respectable. The seasonal pies brought people in November, but the cinnamon rolls were the reason people came back. They were the reason people drove from 3 towns over on a Saturday morning. They were the reason the bakery survived its first year, which was by any honest accounting brutal. There were weeks when they did not pay themselves. There were months when Helen sat at the desk in the back office and stared at numbers that refused to add up and wondered if she had been a fool to believe this could work. And every time she reached that point, every single time Bobby would appear in the doorway of the office with flour on his nose and a cup of coffee in each hand, and he would set one down in front of her and lean against the door frame and say the thing he always said. Every morning is a chance to be better than yesterday. He said it at 4 in the morning when they were both exhausted. He said it when the health inspector found a crack in the walk-in cooler door and they had to replace it at a cost they could not absorb. He said it when Helen burned 3 trays of croissants in a row because she was distracted by the accounts, which were not good, which had not been good for months. He said it when the pipe burst in their apartment and they had to sleep at the bakery for 2 nights, while the landlord fixed it and Bobby set up a sleeping bag on the kitchen floor and called it an adventure and Helen called it ridiculous, and they both laughed until they could not breathe. Every morning, a chance. Be better. Helen thought it was foolish. She told him so. He laughed and said she was probably right, but that he preferred foolish to cynical because at least foolish people got up in the morning. He was not wrong about that either. Bobby had a philosophy about people that went beyond the cinnamon rolls in the early mornings and the cheerful stubbornness. He believed that every person who walked through the bakery door was carrying something and that the least you could do was notice. Not fix, not advise, not solve, just notice. Just see. He saw people. That was his gift, not in the vague sentimental way that people use the phrase. He actually saw them. He noticed when the woman from the accounting firm on Elm Street started coming in every morning instead of just Fridays, and he understood without being told that something had changed in her life and she needed a place to be. He noticed when the teenager who delivered their newspaper started looking thinner and asked him quietly if he was eating. He noticed when the couple who came in every Sunday stopped coming in together and started coming in separately on different days. And he put extra care into both their orders and never mentioned it to either of them. He noticed when Evelyn Tate from the post office came in with red eyes and brought her an extra roll without saying why. He noticed when Eugene's hearing aids were off entirely instead of just low, and knew that meant a bad day, and sat with him for 10 minutes reading the sports section aloud. He noticed when the youngest Brennan boy stopped pressing his nose against the glass and started hanging back behind his parents and asked the boy quietly in a voice no one else could hear if everything was okay at school, and the boy told him something he had not told anyone else, and Bobby handled it with the exact right combination of seriousness and gentleness, and the boy went back to pressing his nose against the glass the following week. Bobby saw people the way a good carpenter sees wood. Not just the surface, but the grain, the direction it wants to go, the stress points, the places where it might split if you push wrong or hold together if you support right. Helen watched him do this for 4 years. She watched and she learned, and she began slowly, tentatively, to do it herself. Not with his ease. She was never going to have his ease. She was a woman who had grown up folding towels to avoid violence, and that kind of upbringing does not produce ease. It produces vigilance. It produces the ability to read a room in 2 seconds flat, to know who is angry and who is dangerous and who just needs to be left alone. But Bobby taught her that vigilance could be turned into something other than self-protection. That the same skill that let her survive her father's house could let her see other people the way he did. Not as threats to be managed, but as humans to be witnessed. She was still learning this when he died. It was a Thursday, March 6, 1997. She would remember the date for the rest of her life, the way people remember the dates of earthquakes and assassinations, with an involuntary precision that feels almost cruel. They were in the kitchen. It was 5:15 in the morning. The first batch of cinnamon rolls was in the oven. Bobby was at the prep counter measuring flour for the second batch, and he was humming something. She could never afterward remember what he was humming. She tried for years. She would lie in bed at night and try to reconstruct the melody, turning it over in her mind, the way you turn over a piece of a jigsaw puzzle trying to find where it fits, and it never fit. The tune was gone, swallowed by what came next. He made a sound, not a dramatic sound, not a cry or a shout or anything that would signal to a person that the world was about to split in half. Just a small, surprised sound like a man who has just remembered something he forgot to do. Then he dropped the measuring cup. It hit the floor, and the flour went everywhere, a white cloud that rose and hung in the air like something suspended between two moments, the moment before and the moment after, and Bobby went down. He was on the floor. He was on the floor, and he was not moving, and Helen was beside him in a time interval that she could not measure and would never be able to measure, because time does not work the way it normally works in moments like that. It compresses and stretches simultaneously. It becomes both instantaneous and eternal. She was across the kitchen, and then she was on the floor, and there was no space between those two things, no steps, no movement, just a before and an after. She called 911. She told them the address. She told them her husband was on the floor and was not breathing. She told them to hurry. And then she knelt beside Bobby Calloway on the flour-covered floor of the bakery he had built with his hands, and his faith and his stubborn, foolish belief that the world was kind, and she held his head in her lap, and she talked to him. She told him the rolls were going to burn if he did not get up. She told him Eugene was going to be here in 2 hours, and someone needed to read him the sports section. She told him the Brennan boy had a science project due Monday and had been talking about it all week, and Bobby had promised to help him. She told him she was not done learning from him yet. The paramedics arrived in 9 minutes. They worked for 22 minutes more. And then one of them looked at Helen and said the thing that she already knew, but had not yet allowed to become real. A cerebral aneurysm, a blood vessel in the brain that had been weakening for years, possibly decades, silently and visibly giving no warning and asking no permission. It ruptured at 5:16 on a Thursday morning in a bakery kitchen, and it took Bobby Calloway out of the world as quickly and completely as blowing out a candle. He was 38 years old. He was standing in his kitchen, making cinnamon rolls and humming a song that his wife would spend the rest of her life trying to remember, and then he was gone. There was no goodbye. There was no preparation. There was no chance to say the things you think you will always have time to say. There was only the flower hanging in the air, and the sound of the measuring cup hitting the floor, and the sudden total absence of the person who had taught her that the world was worth believing in. Helen did not cry at the funeral. She stood in the front pew of the Ridgemont Methodist Church in a black dress that she had bought at the Goodwill on Route 99 because she did not own a black dress and had never imagined she would need one this soon. And she listened to the pastor say things about Bobby that were all true and none of them sufficient, and she did not cry. She did not cry when Evelyn hugged her so hard that Helen felt the older woman's ribs through her coat. She did not cry when Eugene, who had gotten hearing aids that worked specifically for the funeral, came up to her afterward and said in his thin, careful voice, "He read me the scores every morning." Who is going to read me the scores? She did not cry when the youngest Brennan boy stood in the reception line with his parents and looked up at her and said, "Who is going to help me with my project?" And his mother pulled him away with an apologetic look, but Helen stopped her and knelt down in front of the boy and said, "I will. Bring it to the bakery on Saturday." And the boy nodded with the absolute trust of a child who has not yet learned that adults sometimes fail to keep their promises. She did not cry when she went back to the bakery that evening and stood in the kitchen and saw the flour still on the floor where it had fallen from the measuring cup, because no one had cleaned it up, because she had told everyone to leave it because cleaning it up would mean it had happened and she was not ready for it to have happened. She cried 3 days later, at 4 in the morning, alone. Standing in the kitchen with her hands in dough, Bobby's recipe, feeling the texture of it under her palms and remembering the way his hands looked when he worked it, the particular rhythm of his kneading, the way he pressed with the heels of his palms and folded with his fingers, and she realized she was going to have to do this alone every morning for the rest of her life, and the weight of that understanding hit her all at once, and she bent forward over the counter and pressed her forehead against the cool metal surface, and she cried until she could not breathe. Then she straightened up. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She finished the dough. She put the rolls in the oven. She opened the bakery at 7. She worked the counter. She smiled at Evelyn and poured Eugene's coffee and watched the Brennan boy press his nose against the glass and helped him with his science project on Saturday, as she had promised, because Bobby had taught her that promises are the architecture of trust, and you do not break them, even when, especially when keeping them, costs you something. She did this the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and every day for the next 2 years. Not because she was brave, not because she was strong, though people would later call her both, because Bobby had said every morning is a chance to be better than yesterday, and she was not going to let the first morning without him be the morning she stopped believing it. Those 2 years were the hardest of her life, harder even than the Scranton years, because at least in Scranton, she had not known what she was missing. Now she knew. She knew exactly what a life with Bobby Calloway in it felt like. And the absence of that was a physical thing, a missing tooth that the tongue cannot leave alone, a phantom limb that aches in weather that is not there. She slept badly. She ate when she remembered to, which was not always. She developed the habit of talking to Bobby out loud in the back office, sitting at his desk with the ledger open, telling him about the day, about the customers, about the small triumphs and failures that made up the running of a bakery. And she did this not because she believed he could hear her, but because the alternative, which was silence, was worse than talking to an empty room. The finances were brutal. Bobby had been the one who handled the accounts, not because Helen could not, but because he enjoyed it, the particular optimism of a man who could look at a spreadsheet full of red numbers and find the one green one and build an entire narrative of hope around it. Without him, the numbers were just numbers, and they were not good numbers. The oven needed repair. The roof leaked in 3 places. The cost of flour and butter and cinnamon kept rising while the prices she could charge her regulars did not, because this was Ridgemont, and Ridgemont was a town where people counted their dollars and expected their cinnamon rolls to cost what they had always cost. She considered selling. She considered it seriously, quietly in the back office at night, with the ledger open and the calculator running, and the math refusing to work no matter how many times she did it. The building was worth something. The equipment was worth something. The name had some local recognition. She could sell it and pay off the remaining debts and walk away with enough to start over somewhere. She thought about this for 3 nights. On the 4th night, she opened the cedar box on the shelf above Bobby's desk, the box where she kept his watch and the receipt from their first day of business, and the small things that were too important to leave unprotected, and she looked at the watch for a long time. Bobby's watch, a simple Timex with a leather band that had been replaced twice in a face that was scratched from years of being worn in a kitchen. He had worn it every day. He said it kept him honest. He said a man who watches the clock is a man who respects other people's time, which was the most Bobby Calloway thing anyone could possibly say. She held the watch, she closed the box, she did not sell the bakery, she kept it. She kept it through the spring of 1998 when the walk-in cooler died and she had to replace it with money she did not have borrowing from a bank that looked at her paperwork and her empty ring finger and the word widow on the application and approved the loan at an interest rate that was not generous. She kept it through the summer when two of her three suppliers raised their prices, and she had to renegotiate every contract from scratch, sitting across from men who looked at her the way men sometimes look at women who are doing things alone, with a mixture of pity and impatience that Helen absorbed and converted into fuel. She kept it through the fall when the Ridgemont Gazette wrote a small piece about local businesses and did not mention her, which should not have mattered, but did, because it felt like the world was already forgetting that the bakery existed. And if the world forgot the bakery existed, then it would forget Bobby existed. And that was the one thing she could not allow. She kept it through the winter of 1998, which was long and cold and quiet. And then it was January of 1999. The morning had started the way every morning started. Quiet. The kind of quiet that used to feel like a gift, and now, after 2 years of it, felt more like a weight Helen had learned to carry without complaining. She was up before 4, same as always. Her alarm did not even go off anymore. Her body just knew. It knew because Bobby had trained it that way back when he was alive, and the two of them would stumble into the kitchen together in the dark, bumping elbows, laughing too loud for 4 in the morning, neither of them caring. Bobby had been gone for 2 years now, but the alarm still did not go off. Her body still knew. She moved through the bakery the way a person moves through a place they have memorized down to the inch. The cold handle of the walk-in, the particular creak of the third floorboard near the mixing station, the smell. God, the smell. Cinnamon and yeast soaked so deep into the walls that Helen sometimes thought it would outlast everything. Outlast her. Outlast the town itself. Long after the last roll was baked and the last customer served and the last person who remembered Bobby Calloway had themselves been forgotten, that smell would still be here embedded in the plaster and the wood the ghost of 10,000 mornings. She pulled out the dough she had prepared the night before and pressed her palms into it. Bobby's recipe, Bobby's cinnamon rolls, Bobby's dream. She had not changed a single ingredient in 6 years. People asked her sometimes why she did not expand, open a second location, get a website, sell them online, do something bigger with what she had built. And Helen would smile in that patient, tired way of hers and say, this was never supposed to be big. It was supposed to be good. That was what Bobby always said. She believed it then. She believed it now, even on the mornings when the quiet got too heavy. By 6:15, the first rolls were in the oven. By 7, the front door was unlocked. The little bell above it chimed twice and the regulars started filing in. Evelyn Tate from the post office setting her purse on the counter and ordering 2 rolls and a black coffee with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing the same thing for 6 years. Old Eugene pointing at the case because his hearing aids were on low again. The Brennan family, all 5 of them, loud and tangled together like a ball of string, the youngest one pressing his nose against the glass of the pastry case with an expression of such concentrated longing that it bordered on religious. Helen worked the counter herself. She always worked the counter herself. She had a part-time girl who came in on weekends, a high school senior named Colleen, who laughed too loud and wiped tables too slowly, but showed up on time, which Helen valued above most other qualities in an employee. Morning, Helen said, Evelyn setting her purse on the counter. 2 rolls and a black coffee. You look tired. I am fine, Evelyn. You always say that. Because I am always fine. Evelyn squinted at her over the rims of her reading glasses with the expression of a woman who had known Helen Calloway for 6 years and was not even slightly convinced. You know what you need, a dog. A dog would be good for you. My sister got a rescue last spring, and she says it changed her whole outlook. I have plants, Helen said, sliding the coffee across the counter. Plants are fine. I can leave them alone. That is exactly the problem, Evelyn said. But she took her coffee and moved to her usual table by the window, because she also knew when Helen Calloway was done with a conversation. It was a little past 9 when the bell above the door chimed again. Helen looked up from the register. The boy who walked in looked like he had been through something and through something. That was the only way to put it. He was young. She would find out later he was 17, though he looked older and younger at the same time the way kids do when life has used them hard. Older in the eyes, which had a flatness to them, a guardedness, the look of someone who has learned to assess every room before they relax in it, if they relax in it at all. Younger in the way he stood, slightly hunched, shoulders drawn, in making himself small in the way of a person who has been taught that taking up space is dangerous. His lip was split. There was a bruise along his jaw, purple and fresh, the kind you do not get from walking into a door, no matter what anyone tells you. His jacket was too thin for January. One of his shoes had a sole that had started to separate, and he walked carefully the way people do when they are trying not to let anyone notice something is wrong. He stood just inside the door and looked at the case of pastries like a man staring at something he had no right to want. Not with hunger, exactly, though hunger was part of it, with something more complicated. The particular longing of a person who has trained himself not to want things, because wanting things is a setup for disappointment, and disappointment when you are 17 and alone and wearing shoes that are falling apart is not an abstract concept. It is a physical weight that you carry in your chest and your shoulders, and the particular way you hold your jaw clenched, ready, prepared for the next thing that will not go the way you hoped. Helen had seen that look before. She had worn it herself once a long time ago, sitting at a counter in Scranton, with 60 cents and a cup of coffee and a woman whose name she never learned, setting a plate of grilled cheese and tomato soup in front of her and saying, "Eat, honey. You look like you need it." She came out from behind the counter. "You hungry?" she said. The boy flinched. Actually flinched, like being spoken to was a thing that startled him. That told her everything she needed to know, and then some. "I have some money," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of someone who had learned not to take up too much space. "I can pay." "I did not ask if you had money," Helen said. "I asked if you were hungry." He stared at her like the question was in a language he did not quite speak. Like the concept of someone asking whether he was hungry simply and directly without condition or transaction was so foreign that his brain needed a moment to translate it. "Yeah," he finally said. "Yeah, I am hungry." She put him at the small table in the back corner, the one Bobby used to call the thinking spot because it was tucked away from the window and the morse and the foot traffic. Bobby had designed the bakery with that table specifically in mind. He said every good space needs a quiet corner, a place where a person can sit and not be watched, and Helen had thought he was being sentimental until she noticed that the thinking spot was always the first table to be taken and the last to be vacated. And she understood that Bobby had known something about people that most architects and designers did not, which was that the thing people need most in a public space is a small piece of privacy. She brought him 3 cinnamon rolls, a glass of orange juice, and a bowl of the soup she always kept on the back burner in winter. Thick potato and leek, Bobby's mother's recipe. Bobby had gotten it from her the year before she died, written on an index card in handwriting so small you needed a magnifying glass to read it, and he had made it every winter since, and Helen had continued making it every winter after he was gone because continuity was the only form of faith she had left. She sat down across from him while he ate. This surprised him. Most adults did not sit down across from him. Most adults barely looked at him. "What is your name?" she asked. A pause. Just a half-second too long. The kind of pause that tells you the answer is going to be constructed rather than retrieved. "Danny," he said. She filed that away without commenting on it. "Okay, Danny, where are you staying?" He chewed, swallowed, looked at the table around. Yeah. Helen folded her hands on the table. She had the particular stillness of a woman who did not need to fill silence with noise. She had learned that from Bobby. Bobby, who could sit in a room for an hour and make you feel more heard than most people could in a week of talking. He had a way of being quiet that was not empty, but full, the quiet of a person who was listening with their whole body, and Helen had spent 4 years learning to replicate it. She was not as good at it as he was. She might never be. But she was good enough. "The shelter on Prescott Street has beds," she said. "They do not ask a lot of questions." Danny glanced up at her. There was something defensive that rose in his face for a moment, and then slowly settled the way an animal's hackles rise and fall. I know about the shelter, he said. I cannot go back there. She nodded. She did not ask why. There were 100 possible reasons why a 17-year-old boy could not go back to a shelter, and most of them were reasons a person should not have to explain to a stranger. Okay, she said, you need a place to sleep. He looked at her like she was a test he was not sure he was supposed to pass. I have a storeroom, she said. It is not much. There is a cot my late husband kept in there for when he worked late. I will put clean sheets on it. You would have to be out by 5 so I can start prep, but you could come back after for breakfast. She paused. And if you want to earn your keep, I have got dishes that need washing and deliveries that need running. I do not do charity. The last part was a lie, but it was a kind one. She had learned in her years behind the counter that some people, especially young men with bruised jaws and careful shoes, could not accept something given freely. They needed it to mean something. They needed to work for it. Not because they were proud, though pride was part of it, but because they needed evidence that they were useful, that they could contribute, that their presence in a space was justified by something other than pity. Danny set down his spoon. He looked at her for a long moment. Why, he said. Why what? Why would you do that? You do not know me. Helen was quiet for a moment. The morning light came through the front windows and lay in long rectangles across the floor. The rolls in the oven smelled like everything warm in the world. Because someone did it for me once, she said, and I never got the chance to pay them back, so I pay it forward when I can. Danny looked at his soup. What if I steal from you? Then I will call the police, and you will have made a bad choice, she said. But I do not think you will. You do not know that. No, she agreed. I do not. But I know a person who is running from something when I see one. And I know that running people need somewhere to land before they can figure out which direction to go. She stood up. Finish your soup. I will make up the cot. He stayed 14 days. 14 days that folded themselves quietly into the rhythm of the bakery, the way a new ingredient folds into dough. Carefully, with some resistance at first, and then completely. He was a good worker. Better than good. He was meticulous in a way that surprised her. He figured out the dish system in one morning and never had to be told twice. He organized the supply closet without being asked, labeling shelves with a black marker in handwriting that was neat and precise. He ran deliveries on the bike she kept in the back alley, the old green Schwinn Bobby had ridden to work before they could afford the van. And he never once came back without every order confirmed and accounted for. He would check the delivery slip against the order form and circle any discrepancies and bring them to Helen's attention with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that details matter. He was quiet at meals. He ate everything she put in front of him, not with the desperation of a person who has been starving, but with the focused attention of a person who has learned not to waste anything. He cleaned his plate completely. He washed it himself. He did not ask about Bobby. Not right away. It was maybe the 4th or 5th night. Helen was closing up and Danny was stacking chairs, and he nodded toward the framed photo she kept behind the register. Bobby in his apron, laughing, flour on his nose. Is that your husband, he said? Was Helen said. A beat? I am sorry, Danny said. And he meant it, she could tell. There is a particular quality of sincerity that young people have when they have been through enough to understand loss, a quality that is different from the polite sympathy of adults who say, I am sorry, because it is what you say. Danny said it because he knew what it meant to lose something you needed. He was a good man, she said, the best I have ever known. He believed people could change. He believed that even when most people did not, even when the evidence was against him. She smiled at the photo. He was stubborn like that. Called it hope. I called it foolish. But he was right more often than I was. Danny was quiet for a moment, stacking the last chair. My dad was not like that, he said. It came out flat and contained. The way things come out when a person has pressed the feeling down for a long time, compressing it into something small and dense and manageable, and then it escapes in a single sentence that sounds casual but is anything but. Helen did not push. She just said, I am sorry. Do not be, he said. I do not think about him anymore. That was a lie, but it was his lie, and she let him have it. She had learned from Bobby that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person is to accept the story they are telling about themselves, even when you know it is not true, and wait for them to be ready to tell the real one. Over the next several nights, the real story came out in pieces. Not because Helen asked. She did not ask. She simply remained present, available, and Danny began in the way that young people do when they feel safe for the first time in years, it's to release the things he had been carrying. His father was a man of terrible tempers, the kind of man who could be perfectly calm for 3 weeks and then explode over a glass left on the wrong counter, and the explosion would last for hours and leave marks that took longer to fade than the 3 weeks of calm that had preceded them. Danny's mother had left when he was 9. She had not taken him with her. He did not know where she was. He did not look. He had gone into foster care at 12. 3 homes in 2 years. The first was indifferent, a house where he was fed and sheltered and ignored, which was better than what he had come from, but not by as much as the system wanted to believe. The second was worse than his father, which he had not thought possible. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The silence around that sentence was its own description. The third was fine until the family had a baby of their own, and Danny became in the particular calculus of resource allocation that governs the foster system surplus. Not unwanted exactly, but unnecessary. A chair at a table that was suddenly too small. He had been on his own since 15. Streets, shelters, the back seats of unlocked cars, the particular geography of a boy who has learned to be invisible because invisibility is the only protection he has ever reliably had. Helen listened to all of it without interrupting. She listened the way Bobby would have listened, with the full weight of her attention and the complete absence of judgment. And when Danny was finished, she said the things she had learned from Bobby, which was not advice and was not comfort and was not any of the things that most people say when confronted with the pain of another person, which is to say it was not about her at all. She said, "You are worth more than what happened to you." She said it simply the way you state a fact. The sky is blue. Water is wet. You are worth more than what happened to you. And Danny looked at her with an expression that she would carry in her memory for 25 years, the expression of a person who has just heard something they desperately needed to hear and are not yet sure they can believe. It was the 12th night. The bakery was closed. Helen was wiping down the counters and Danny was sweeping the floor, and the quiet between them was the kind that exists between people who have stopped needing to fill it. Then Danny said, "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." He stopped sweeping. He held the broom handle with both hands and looked at the floor. "The morning I came in here," he said, "the morning I walked through that door," he paused, "I was not looking for food." Helen stopped wiping. She did not turn around. She stood very still with her hand on the counter and her back to him, and she waited. "I had made up my mind," he said. His voice was flat and controlled and frighteningly calm. "That morning was supposed to be my last day. I had a plan. I had it all figured out. I was walking past this building and I smelled something." He paused again, longer this time. "It smelled like my grandmother's kitchen. She died when I was 7. She was the only person who ever—" He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The shape of the missing words was clear enough. She was the only person who ever made him feel safe. She was the only person who ever made him feel wanted. She was the only person who ever made him feel like something other than a problem to be managed. "I came in because of the smell," he said. "That is the only reason. If the bakery had not smelled like that, I would not have come in. And if I had not come in—" He trailed off. Helen turned around. She looked at this boy, this 17-year-old boy with his hands on a broom handle and his eyes on the floor, and the entire architecture of his pain visible in the line of his shoulders. And she felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a word for. Something that was not pity and was not sadness, but was closer to recognition. The recognition of one survivor by another. The understanding that passes between two people who have both stood on the edge and decided for whatever reason to step back. She walked over to him. She did not touch him. She stood close enough that he could feel her presence, but far enough that he had space. "Then it is a good thing you came in," she said. That was all she said. He looked up at her, and something passed between them in that moment that was simpler and more important than any of the words that came before or after it. The simple fact of being seen. The irreducible weight of one person looking at another and saying without words, "I know what you are carrying, and I am not going to Look away from it. Danny nodded once. He went back to sweeping. Helen went back to wiping the counter. They finished closing in silence. 2 days later, he was gone. Helen came in at 4 in the morning and found the storeroom cot, neatly made corners, tucked pillow, straight, the folded blanket on top, so precise it made her chest ache. On the small folding table beside it was the key she had given him, and under the key was a piece of notebook paper. She stood there in the cold dark and unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, controlled, the handwriting of someone who had been taught by whoever had taught him that even small things deserve to be done right. Mrs. Calloway, I do not know how to say thank you for this, so I am just going to say it straight. You did not have to help me, and you did anyway. And I know you said it was not charity, but it was. And I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out how to be the kind of person who deserves it. Danny, P.S. I topped off the flour bins. The bag of bread flour in the back is getting low. Helen read it twice. She folded it back along its creases. She walked into the kitchen, and there under the sink, the faucet that had been dripping for 3 weeks, the one she had complained about every morning while Danny washed dishes, was silent. He had fixed it. Sometime in the night, quietly, without being asked. The last thing he did before he left. She pressed the letter against her chest for a moment. Then she tucked it into the front pocket of her apron and started the ovens. She never told anyone about the letter. Not Evelyn, not Colleen, not the handful of close friends who asked sometimes in quiet moments whether she was lonely. She kept it in the cedar box on the shelf in the back office alongside Bobby's watch and the receipt from their first day of business. She kept it through 7 moves of furniture, through 2 break-ins, through the water damage that ruined half the storeroom the winter of 2007. She kept it because it was the only evidence she had that Danny had existed, that those 2 weeks had happened, that the things she had done in the dark mattered to someone. She never stopped wondering about Danny, whether he had made it, whether he had found what he was running toward, whether the things she had given him, 2 weeks of soup and honest work and a little bit of Bobby's philosophy about second chances, had been enough. She told herself it had, because the alternative was too heavy to carry on top of everything else. 25 years is a long time. 25 years is long enough to stop expecting the knock at the door, long enough to stop scanning strangers' faces in the grocery store, thinking maybe, long enough to fold the wondering away like an old piece of paper and press it flat under the weight of everything else there was to do and feel and survive. The first years after Danny left were the quietest. The bakery was exactly the same. The counter, the case, the regulars, Evelyn's coffee, Eugene's pointing. The Brennan boys' nose on the glass, everything in its place, everything accounted for. Except now there was a fixed faucet under the sink that someone else had fixed, in a cedar box with one more item in it than it had held before, and a woman behind the counter who had learned something about herself that she could not unlearn, which was that she was capable of sitting across from a person in the dark and keeping them alive, and that this capability, once discovered, does not go dormant. It waits. It watches the door. She watched the door. She did not admit this to anyone, not even to Evelyn, who could read Helen's face the way some people read weather, and who said once in the spring of 2000, "You are looking for somebody." And Helen had said, "I am not looking for anybody." And Evelyn had squinted at her over the rims of her reading glasses and said, "You are a terrible liar, Helen Calloway, and I hope whoever it is walks through that door someday." Helen changed the subject. Evelyn let her. That was the contract of their friendship. Evelyn pushed exactly far enough, and then she stopped, and Helen appreciated the push and the stop in equal measure. The years moved. In 2001, the towers fell, and the world rearranged itself in ways that reached even Ridgemont, Pennsylvania, which was not a place accustomed to being reached by the world. Helen put a flag at the bakery window and made an extra 50 cinnamon rolls on September 12th because people came in that morning in a way they had not come in before, not for pastry, but for proximity, for the particular comfort of standing near other people in a place that smelled like something safe. In 2003, somebody broke into the bakery. They came through the back door, which Helen had always known was too flimsy, and they took the cash register and a box of rolling pins, and for reasons Helen would never understand, 3 bags of cinnamon. The police came and filed a report and said they would do their best, which was the particular language of law enforcement that means nothing will happen. What the thief did not take was the cedar box. It was on the shelf in the back office in plain sight, and the thief had either not noticed it or not cared. Helen stood in the office the morning after the break-in and looked at the boss and felt something she could not name. Not relief exactly. Something closer to a message. As if the universe, which was not a thing Helen generally believed communicated in such direct terms, had said, "This one stays. This one is not for losing." She replaced the back door with a steel one. In 2007, the storeroom flooded. A pipe burst in the wall during the first hard freeze of December, and by the time Helen arrived at 4 in the morning, there was 3 inches of standing water across the storeroom floor. The cot was ruined. The folding table was warped. The boxes of napkins and paper goods she kept stacked along the back wall were destroyed. She stood in the doorway in her boots and looked at the water and thought about a wall making a bed with hospital corners in the dark and leaving a key on a folding table that was now buckled and split. She thought about the faucet he had fixed, which still did not drip 8 years later. The permanence of small acts of care. The way they outlast the people who perform them. She called the plumber. She called the insurance company. She spent 3 days hauling ruined inventory to the dumpster and another 2 days scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees with bleach and hot water. Evelyn showed up on the second day with rubber gloves and a bucket and the particular expression of a woman who has decided she is going to be useful and does not intend to discuss it. They worked in silence. At one point, Evelyn said, "You know what you need, a dog?" And Helen said, "I have plants." And Evelyn said, "Plants cannot fetch." And Helen said nothing because, after years of friendship, Evelyn also knew when Helen Calloway was done with a conversation. The recession came in 2008 and stayed through 2009, and the bakery hung on by margins that would have made Bobby's optimistic spreadsheet narratives impossible to construct. Helen cut her own pay to zero for 6 months. She kept making the cinnamon rolls. She kept opening at 7. She kept the lights on and the coffee hot and the door unlocked because closing the door was not an option she was willing to consider, and so she did not consider it. The years kept moving. The Brennan boy who pressed his nose against the glass grew up and went to college and came back once during a holiday break and bought a cinnamon roll and ate it at the counter with the expression of a young man returning to a place that made him who he is and realizing for the first time that it is smaller than he remembered and more important than he knew. He was 26 now and working on to Pittsburgh. Eugene got hearing aids that worked. The improvement was dramatic. He started ordering by voice instead of pointing, and his voice, which Helen had rarely heard at full volume, was reedy and precise and strangely formal, like a man who had been rehearsing his lines during all those years of silence. Evelyn retired from the post office. This changed nothing about her mornings. She still arrived at 7:05. She still ordered 2 rolls and a black coffee. She still sat at her table by the window with her reading glasses and her opinions and her particular talent for knowing exactly what Helen needed to hear, and exactly when to say it, and exactly when to shut up. Helen turned 50, then 55, then 60. The pandemic arrived in March of 2020 and very nearly took everything. The bakery closed for the first time in its history, not by choice, by order. Helen stood in the empty bakery on a Monday morning and listened to a silence that was different from any silence she had known, because this silence was enforced, and enforced silence has a quality of violence to it that voluntary silence does not. She pivoted to takeout and delivery. She did this within 48 hours because she was Helen Calloway, and she had been pivoting her entire life. She made the cinnamon rolls. She boxed them. She drove them to people's doors herself in the old van that Bobby had bought in 1996, and she set them on doorsteps and knocked and stepped back 6 feet and waited until the door opened because she needed to see the faces. She needed to see the faces. The bakery nearly went under anyway. 2 months in, the numbers were impossible. Helen sat in the back office at Bobby's desk and looked at the ledger and knew with the cold arithmetic certainty that she had always possessed and Bobby had always softened that she had 6 weeks of operating funds left. Evelyn organized a community fundraiser. She did this without asking Helen's permission because she knew Helen would have said no, and she was right. Evelyn stood on her front porch and made phone calls for 3 days straight, and at the end of 3 days, she had raised enough money to keep the bakery open for 6 more months. Helen found out about the fundraiser when a check arrived in the mail with a note from Evelyn that said, "Do not thank me. Do not argue. Cash it." Helen cashed it. She did not thank Evelyn. She did not argue. The years continued. Helen turned 61, 62, 63. She hired Savannah Pryor, a part-time girl who came in on weekends and some weekdays. Savannah was 22 years old with her grandmother's laugh and her mother's tendency to text when she thought no one was looking. She was young and quick and had the kind of uncomplicated competence that Helen had learned to value above all other qualities in an employee, which was a short list because Helen did not have employees. She had Savannah. And through all of it, through every year and every morning and every batch of cinnamon rolls pulled from the oven, at exactly the same time, Helen kept the cedar box on the shelf in the back office. She kept Bobby's watch. She kept the receipt. She kept the letter. She never opened the box without reading the letter. She never read the letter without wondering. She never wondered without hoping. And she never hoped without feeling underneath the hope the particular ache of a question that has no answer, which is whether the things you do in the dark with no audience and no applause and no guarantee that they mean anything at all actually travel, whether they go anywhere, whether they matter. She could not know. She could only hope. And then it was October. Helen was 63 years old on the morning of October 14th. She had been running the bakery for 29 years. She had outlasted 2 renovations, 1 recession, a global pandemic that nearly took the building from her and Evelyn's retirement from the post office. She still made Bobby's cinnamon rolls every morning. She still took them out of the oven at exactly the same time. She still paused every single time for just a second before she moved on to the next thing. Old Eugenia had finally gotten hearing aids that worked. The Brennan boy who used to press his nose against the pastry case was now 26 and working in Pittsburgh. And Ridgemont was still quiet, except for that Tuesday in October. Helen was at the register running the mid-morning numbers when she heard it. A low rumble. Distant at first the way thunder starts before a storm you did not see coming, she glanced toward the window and did not see anything yet. But the sound was already in her chest, already vibrating against her sternum. The glass in the pastry case shook. Then Evelyn, who had come in for her morning rolls even in retirement, because some things do not change, stood up from her table by the window with the expression of a woman who had just seen something she could not explain. "Helen," she said, and that was all she said. Helen came out from behind the counter. Through the window, she saw the first one turn the corner onto Archer Street. A Harley-Davidson Chrome catching the October light. A man on it who looked like he had been carved out of something harder than most things in this world. Then the second one turned the corner. Then the third. And then they kept coming, one after another, the sound building on itself until the whole street was a wall of noise and motion. Until Evelyn had both hands pressed flat against the window and her coffee completely forgotten. Until Savannah, who was wiping down tables in the back, came running out to see what was happening and stopped dead in the doorway with her mouth open. Helen counted. She could not help it. Her mind just started counting the way it always had when something big was happening, and she needed something to hold on to. 10, 20, 50, 100. 178 motorcycles pulled onto Archer Street in Ridgemont, Pennsylvania on a Tuesday morning in October. And every single one of them stopped in front of Helen Calloway's bakery. The street went quiet, not silent. The engines were still running a low collective growl, but quiet the way a room goes quiet when something is about to happen. Helen's hand was on the edge of the counter. She was gripping it without meaning to. "What in the Savannah started?" "Shh," Helen said. The man at the front of the line cut his engine. One by one up and down the street, the others followed until the sound fell away, and there was nothing but the smell of exhaust and October air and the faraway sound of a dog barking 3 blocks over. The lead rider sat on his bike for a moment. Then he swung off and stood, and he was enormous, not just tall but present. The kind of man who takes up space not because he is trying to, but because he simply does. His jacket had the patch, the wings, the letters, Hell's Angels. He walked toward the bakery door. Helen did not move. Every cell in her body was telling her to do something. Call someone. Step back. Say a word. But she stood at the counter with her hand on its edge, and she watched the door open. And she watched this man walk in. And she looked at his face. And something happened in her chest that she had not felt in 25 years. Not fear, recognition. Not full recognition, not yet, but the edge of it. The trembling edge of a memory she had pressed flat in a cedar box alongside a watch and a receipt and a piece of notebook paper. And it was rising up through the floorboards of her now, and she could not name it yet, but she could feel it. He stopped across the counter from her. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read, something between searching and certain, the face of a man who had driven a long way and was finally where he intended to be. "Helen Calloway," he said. His voice was deep, quiet, controlled. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Around them, through the window, she could see his riders, all 177 of them, sitting perfectly still on their bikes, waiting. "Do you remember," he said slowly, "feeding a kid in 1999? The bakery went absolutely silent. The rolls in the oven, the low hum of the display case, the distant dog now quiet. All of it fell away. And Helen Calloway stood in the middle of her late husband's dream, 25 years of wondering pressing up against the inside of her ribs, and she looked at the man across the counter from her, and she said in a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to expect, "I remember." The silence between them lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt like 3 years. Helen's fingers were still pressed flat against the counter. She could feel the grain of the wood underneath her palms, the worn-down edge where thousands of customers had leaned over the years, where Bobby used to rest his elbows when he was tired, where she had pressed her forehead more than once on the bad nights when the bakery was closed and she was alone with missing him like a missing tooth that the tongue cannot leave alone. She felt all of that in those 3 seconds. She felt 25 years. "You remember?" the man repeated. Not a question this time. Something quieter than a question. Something that sounded almost like relief. "A boy," Helen said. Her voice was careful. She was holding it steady the way you hold a full cup. Slowly, deliberately, because if you rush it, you spill. 17, maybe. Came in out of the cold. January. His face was. She stopped. He was in bad shape. The man nodded once. He said his name was Danny. Helen continued. But I was not entirely sure that was true. Something moved across the man's face. A flicker fast like a card turned over and turned back before you could read it. "It was not," he said. "My name is Elias, Elias Greer." Helen looked at him, really looked at him the way she had not allowed herself to do yet, because doing it too quickly felt like reaching for something she might drop. She looked at the line of his jaw, the set of his eyes, the way he held himself. Contained. Careful. Like a man who had trained himself out of flinching. She thought about the boy who had flinched when she spoke to him, who had held a broom handle with both hands and looked at the floor, who had said my dad was not like that in a voice that was flat and contained and frighteningly controlled. She thought, there he is, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, certain landing, the way a key turns in a lock it was made for. "Elias," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She exhaled through her nose. "You look," she stopped again. "Different," he offered. "I was going to say well," she said. "You look well." That broke something open in him that he clearly had not planned on. She could see it happen. A small fracture in the controlled surface of him, there and then sealed back almost immediately. But she caught it. She had spent 29 years behind a counter, reading people's faces. She caught it. "I am," he said. "Now." Behind her, Savannah had not moved from the doorway to the back. Helen could feel the girl watching, could practically hear her trying to decide whether to say something or disappear entirely. And Evelyn was still at her table by the window, both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, completely motionless, in the way that Evelyn only ever got motionless when something important was happening. "You want to sit down?" Helen asked. "I would appreciate that," Elias said. She came out from behind the counter. She nodded once at Savannah. "It is fine. Go." And Savannah vanished into the back with the particular speed of a 22-year-old who understood she had just witnessed something private. Helen led Elias to the back corner table, Bobby's thinking spot. She did not realize until they were both seated that she had done it instinctively, that out of every table in the bakery she had brought this man to the exact spot where she had fed that boy 25 years ago. Her hands were in her lap. She looked down at them for a moment, then back up. "Tell me," she said. Elias leaned forward. His forearms were on the table. His hands were large and scarred across the knuckles in the way of a man who had used them hard for many years, and they were completely still. "When I left here," he said, "I had $43, a change of clothes, and your husband's recipe for getting up in the morning." Helen blinked. "What you told me," he said. That last night when you were closing up, you told me Bobby used to say every morning is a chance to be better than yesterday. That is all. Every morning is a chance, he paused. I wrote it down. I had it on a piece of paper in my pocket for 4 years until the paper finally fell apart. Helen's throat tightened. She pressed her lips together and said nothing. I left because I had to. Elias continued. There were people looking for me. I do not need you to know all of the details of what I was running from, but I need you to know that it was serious. And I need you to know that when I walked into your bakery that morning, I had already decided it was going to be my last day. He said it plainly without dramatizing it, just laid it down on the table between them like a fact. I had made up my mind. Helen went absolutely still. And then you put soup in front of me, he said, and you sat down. And you did not ask me why I looked the way I looked. You just sat down, like I was worth sitting across from. He shook his head once. You have no idea what that does to a person who has spent years being told he is worth nothing. The bell above the front door chimed. Helen did not move. She heard Evelyn get up quietly, heard the soft exchange of voices, heard the door close again. Evelyn was running interference. After all their years of friendship, the woman had earned it. After I left, Elias said I went south, ended up in North Carolina, got picked up for some work on a construction crew that did not ask for references, which was the only kind of work I could get. Did that for about a year. Stayed out of trouble mostly. He allowed himself a small, dry sound that was not quite a laugh. Met a man named Hank Morrison. He was a Hell's Angel, and he was the first grown man who ever told me the truth about myself, which was that I was angry and I was smart, and if I did not point the angry somewhere useful, the smart was going to get me killed. Hank sounds like he knew what he was talking about, Helen said. Hank was the second person who ever saw me, Elias said. You were the first. The weight of that landed between them and stayed there. He brought me in, Elias continued. Not to the life you are probably imagining. I know what people think when they hear Hell's Angels. I am not going to pretend it is all church picnics. But what Hank gave me, what the Brotherhood gave me, was something I had never had. A code. People who showed up. People who kept their word. He looked at his hands. Hank died in 2019. Pancreatic cancer. He was gone in 4 months. And before he died, he made me promise to do what you did. To see people. To sit across from the ones who had decided it was their last day and just be there. And did you? Helen said quietly. I have been doing it for 15 years, Elias said. Me and some of the brothers. We started small, showing up at shelters, doing rides for veterans, working with kids aging out of foster care. Because those are the ones nobody wants. The ones who turn 18 and the system just. He paused and made a gesture with one hand, something sharp and dismissive, a door slamming shut. They fall through every single time, and nobody goes looking for them. How many, Helen asked? How many kids? Elias was quiet for a moment. In 15 years through the foundation, we built directly served, meaning housed, mentored, employed 212 young people. He met her eyes. But if you count the ones those kids have gone on to reach, the jobs they created, the families they built, the kids they did not abandon because someone showed them what it looked like to not be abandoned. He shook his head. I stopped counting. Helen sat back in her chair. Something was happening in her chest that she did not have a clean word for. It was not just emotion, though there was plenty of that. It was more like pressure releasing, like something she had been holding for years without even knowing she was holding it was slowly being set down. Why are you here, she said, not unkindly but directly, because she needed to know. Elias reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table between them. A thick envelope, cream-colored, sealed. He pressed it flat with one hand and left it there. We bought a building, he said, in Pittsburgh, 11,000 square feet. We have been renovating it for 2 years. It has a kitchen, a workshop space, 12 residential rooms, and a classroom. He paused. We want someone to run it, someone who knows what it looks like to see a person who has been made to feel worthless and make them feel like they are worth sitting across from. Helen stared at the envelope. That is the deed, he said. And it is not a loan. It is not contingent on anything. The building belongs to the foundation. What is in that envelope is our proposal for the director position and the first 3 years of operational funding fully committed. She did not touch it. We did not come to ambush you, he said, and his voice shifted. A fraction softer, a fraction more careful. I know this is a lot. I have been planning this for 2 years, and I am still sitting here, not entirely sure I did it right. He looked at her directly. I should have written first or called. I needed to see your face. Why, Helen said. Because I needed to make sure you were real, he said quietly. I have been carrying you for 25 years, and sometimes a thing you carry for that long starts to feel like something you invented. I needed to see you and know you were real, and that what happened here actually happened. Helen's eyes were burning. She was not a woman who cried easily. Bobby used to say she had the emotional economy of a New England winter. Everything locked up tight except for the moments when it was not. And then it was everything at once. She blinked twice hard and looked at the table. You brought 178 people, she said. Yes. To a bakery in Ridgemont, Pennsylvania. Yes. Elias, that is. That is, every single one of them has a story, he said. Not like mine. Every story is different. But every single person on those bikes has been where I was. Discarded. Running. Decided. And every single one of them is alone and standing because somewhere along the way, somebody sat down across from them. He leaned forward slightly. We wanted you to see what you started. Not just me. All of it. All of them. Helen pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment, breathed through her nose, steadied herself. I did not start anything, she said. I fed a boy soup. You fed a boy soup, Elias agreed. And that boy is sitting across from you right now, telling you that 212 people have a life they would not have had without it. The front door chimed. Helen looked up. It was one of the riders, younger than Elias, late 30s maybe, with the same jacket and a scar along his left temple that had healed silver. He stopped just inside the door, looked at Elias, and Elias gave a small nod. The man turned and went back out. They want to come in, Helen said. It was not a question. Not all at once, Elias said quickly. I told them no more than a few. There are 5 men out there who have asked me to ask you if they could speak with you directly. Just briefly. He paused. You do not have to. Helen looked at the envelope on the table, then at the man across from her, who had once been a boy with a split lip and a too-thin jacket and a piece of notebook paper that he had carried until it fell apart. Who are they? She said. Elias exhaled slowly. People you have never met, he said, who are alive because of something that began in this bakery. Helen waited. When I started the foundation, he said I talked about you, not your name. I did not use your name without your permission. But I talked about what you did, the soup, the cot, the job that was not charity because you knew I needed it to mean something. I told that story to every single kid we brought in. He stopped. And 3 of those kids grew up and joined our chapter. And 2 of their friends came with them. And those 5 men are standing outside right now because they wanted to be here when I found you. Send them in, she said. The first man through the door was named Emmett. He was broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, which was a combination Helen had rarely encountered in one person, and he took off his helmet before he stepped inside, which she noticed because it was the kind of small courtesy that reveals everything about how a person was raised or how hard they worked to become someone their raising did not prepare them for. He held the helmet under one arm like a man holding a hat at a funeral. Respectful, careful. He stopped a few feet from her table. Mrs. Calloway, he said, I am not going to take much of your time. You can have as much of it as you need, Helen said. Sit down. He sat. He put his helmet on the chair beside him. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at her with the directness of a man who had rehearsed this and then decided to abandon the rehearsal entirely and just say the true thing. I was 17 when Elias found me, he said. I was living behind a gas station in Greensboro. Had been for 6 weeks. When he brought me in the first night, the very first night, he sat me down and told me about a woman in Pennsylvania, a bakery, a bowl of soup. He paused. He told me that story every time one of us wanted to quit, when it got hard, when it felt pointless, when the kids we were trying to reach threw it back in our faces or disappeared or made the worst possible choices. He would tell us about the woman who sat down across from a boy she did not know and acted like he was worth her time. He said that story was the foundation. Emmett looked at her steadily. I have told that story 143 times. I kept count. Every kid I have ever worked with has heard it. He paused. I just needed you to know that. Helen's throat was so tight, it was an effort to speak. Thank you, she managed, for counting. The second man was named Nolan. He was younger, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of energy that filled a room without quite settling. He sat down fast, clasped his hands, unclenched them, looked at her with something urgent in his eyes. I just want to say one thing, Nolan said, because Elias told me to keep it short, and I am going to trim her. He exhaled. My daughter is 8 years old. She is alive. I am present in her life. I coach her soccer team on Saturday mornings. He stopped. Let that land. 2 years before she was born, I was not a person who was going to be present in anyone's life. I was not a person who was going to be around. He looked at Helen directly. Elias's foundation pulled me out. And Elias's foundation exists because of what you did in 1999. So when I am on that soccer field on Saturday morning and she runs at me and I pick her up, his voice broke just the once. He pressed his mouth shut, steadied himself, tried again. That moment exists because of a bowl of soup you gave a kid you did not know. I just needed you to understand the distance that travels. Helen pressed both hands flat on the table. The third man did not introduce himself right away. He walked in, stood across from her, and said, I used to be the kid nobody came back for. I aged out of foster care at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes and $60. I have been in this foundation for 9 years. I now run our employment program. Last year, I placed 31 young people in full-time jobs with benefits. He stopped. My name is Warren. I run numbers for a living, now Mrs. Calloway. And the number I want you to know is 31. Because every single one of those 31 people has a story that starts with yours. He reached across the table and shook her hand once firmly, and then he walked back out. Helen stared at the door after it closed. Elias, standing near the counter, said quietly, You okay? She looked at him. No, she said honestly. But keep going. The fourth man was older, mid-50s, weathered in the way of a man who had lived outdoors for some portion of his life, whether he chose to or not. He sat down across from Helen, and he did not speak for a moment. He just looked at her. And then he said, I do not have numbers for you. I do not have a success story to give you. I have been sober for 6 years. Before that, I was not sober for 11. And before that, I was. He stopped, reorganized. I was the kind of man that people crossed the street to avoid. I was the kind of man that nobody would sit across from. Elias's people sat across from me anyway. Would not let me go. Come on. Told me I was worth the effort when I had given them every possible reason to believe otherwise. He folded his hands. His name, she would learn later, was Franklin, and he had been a veteran. And the details of the 11 years would stay between him and the people who had earned the right to know them. I am 54 years old, he said. I should not be. I know that. And I know that the chain that kept me here runs all the way back to you. He stood. He looked at her with the simple gravity of a man who had made peace with being alive and found it an enormous and humbling thing. I just wanted to see your face, he said. Same as Elias did. I just wanted to know what the beginning of all this looked like. He walked out. Helen had to stand. She pushed back from the table and stood and walked to the counter and put both hands on it and breathed. Behind her, she heard the bakery door open and the quiet of one person entering, and she did not turn around right away. She needed a moment. She needed 10 moments, and she was only going to get one, so she used it carefully. Then she turned. The fifth man was young, 23, maybe 24. He was the smallest of the 5, slender, standing near the door, like he was not entirely sure he was allowed to be here, holding his helmet in both hands. In front of him, the way a child holds something they are afraid of dropping. He looked up when she turned. He had the most open face she had seen in years, not naive. There was nothing naive about it. It was the face of someone who had known hard things and decided as an act of will not to let those things close him off. That kind of openness cost something. Helen knew exactly what it cost. Mrs. Calloway, he said. His voice was younger than the rest of them, steadier than you would expect. Come sit down, she said. He crossed the room and sat. He placed his helmet on the table and looked at her and said, My name is Robert. The air went out of the room. Helen sat very still. Elias told you, the young man said. It was not a question. He told me you chose that name, she said. Robert nodded. When I aged out of the system, I had to fill out paperwork for my legal name change. And they asked me, the woman at the office, she asked me where the name came from, whether it was a family name. He paused. I told her it was. He met Helen's eyes. Is that okay? I hope that is okay. I did not ask permission, and I have thought about that. Helen said nothing for a moment. He sounds like he was a good man, Robert said quickly from what Elias told us. The second chances thing, the cinnamon rolls, the way he saw people. He paused. I wanted a name that had those things already built into it. I did not have anything from my own family worth carrying. So I took something that belonged to somebody worth carrying. He looked down at the helmet. I am sorry if that was wrong. Helen reached across the table and put her hand over his. He stopped talking. She did not say anything for a moment. She just held his hand the way you hold the hand of someone who needs to feel the weight of another person, which is a specific and irreplaceable thing that no amount of words can substitute for. Then she said Bobby would have been so proud. Robert did not cry. His jaw worked for a moment and his eyes went bright. And he pressed his lips together and breathed through his nose and kept himself together in the way that young men do when they have been taught by hard experience that falling apart is a luxury they cannot always afford. But he kept her hand, and she kept his. They sat like that for a moment that Helen knew even while it was happening, she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Then Robert looked up and said, "Are you going to take the job?" Helen almost laughed. The directness of it. The sheer uncomplicated directness of a young man cutting straight through 20 minutes of ceremony to the actual question. I do not know yet, she said. Elias has been planning this for 2 years, Robert said. Not pressuring, just informing. He almost drove here 4 times before today. Each time he turned around about an hour out. He said he was not ready. He said he needed to be sure. He paused. I do not know what he was waiting to be sure about. I just know that this morning when he finally pulled out of the lot, all 178 of us behind him, he did not look back once. Helen looked at the envelope still sitting on the table where Elias had left it. She had not opened it. I need to think, she said. Robert nodded. He stood, gathered his helmet. I just want to say one more thing, if that is okay. Go ahead. The building in Pittsburgh. He paused. The kitchen in it. It is big. Commercial grade. The kind of kitchen you could teach in. He looked at her carefully. Elias did not tell me to say that. I just thought you should know what you would be working with. He walked out. Helen stood alone in the middle of the bakery. Through the window, she could see them all. 178 men in Hell's Angels jackets standing beside their bikes in the October light. Some of them were talking quietly. Some of them were watching the door. All of them were waiting. Elias came back inside. He leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. Not crowding her, not pushing. Just there. The way Hank must have been there for him, she thought. Present without pressure. Available without demanding. It is a lot, he said. It is a lot, she agreed. I know this is your life, he said. This bakery. I know what it means. I would never ask you to. You are not asking me to give it up, Helen said. It was not a question. No, Elias said. The foundation can support a manager here if you want to keep it running. We are not here to take anything from you. We are here because you have something we need, something that cannot be hired for or bought. He paused. You know how to see people, Helen. And the kids at that building in Pittsburgh need someone who knows how to see them. Behind her, the oven timer went off. Bobby's cinnamon rolls. Right on schedule. Same as every morning for 29 years. She did not get up. For the first time in 29 years, Helen Calloway let the rolls wait. Helen walked to the back counter, reached under it, and pulled out 2 mugs. She poured coffee into both without asking. She slid one across to Elias. He took it without comment. They stood on opposite sides of the counter, drinking coffee, the 2 of them in the quiet of a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and 29 years of showing up. Outside, the street held 178 people who were alive. Then Elias said carefully, "There is one more thing." Helen looked up. He reached into his jacket again. Not the envelope this time. This was smaller. A folded piece of plastic heat-sealed, the kind of preservation you do when something is too fragile to exist in open air anymore. He set it on the counter between them. Inside the plastic, she could see paper. Old paper, creased and soft with handling, the edges worn to nothing. The handwriting on it was faded but legible. She could read it from where she stood. She could read it because she knew every word. Mrs. Calloway, I do not know how to say thank you for this, so I am just going to say it straight. Her breath stopped. You kept it, she whispered. I told you, Elias said, until it fell apart, and then I had it preserved. He looked at it on the counter between them. I wrote that when I was 17 years old and I meant every word of it, and I have meant it every day since. He paused. I thought you should have it back. I thought you should know it existed, that it was real, that it was always real. Helen looked at the note for a long time, at the careful handwriting of a 17-year-old boy who had been made to feel worthless and was trying to say thank you in the only way he knew how. At the words she had read in a cold, dark storeroom in January of 1999, and then carried in a cedar box for 25 years. She reached out and touched the plastic with 2 fingers. She did not pick it up. She just touched it. And then the thing that she had been holding all morning, the thing that she had been holding for 25 years, shifted, not broke, not collapsed, shifted. The way tectonic plates shift miles underground, imperceptible at the surface, but rearranging everything. She had wondered every day whether the things she did in the dark mattered, whether a bowl of soup and a cot and 2 weeks of honest work and a little bit of Bobby's philosophy amounted to anything more than a brief warmth in a cold world. And now the answer was standing across the counter from her, 6 feet tall and scarred and present and alive with 178 people behind him and a piece of paper between them that had been carried in a pocket for 25 years and then sealed in plastic because it was too important to lose. The answer was yes. The answer had always been yes. Elias, she said. Yes. The first program. She kept her eyes on the note. At the building, yes. I want it to be a bakery program, she said. Not a mechanics program, not a wood shop. A bakery. Teaching these kids to make something with their hands that other people need, something that makes a room smell like safety. She paused. Bobby always wanted to teach people to bake. He said food is the first language of home. He said if you can feed someone, you can make them feel like they belong somewhere. She looked up. We will call it the Bobby Calloway Kitchen. Elias said nothing for a moment. Then he said, that is exactly right, and I have one condition, Helen said. Name it, I keep this bakery open. She said it flatly, the way you state a thing that is not negotiable. Whatever arrangement you need to make to allow that you make it. This building was Bobby's dream. It was his first. It does not close. Done, Elias said immediately. And one more thing. He waited. That note, she said, looking at the plastic-sealed piece of paper on the counter. We frame it. We hang it in the kitchen at the new building where every kid who comes through can read it. Because the thing that saved you was not soup. The thing that saved you was knowing that someone thought you were worth the trouble of a handwritten thank you. I want those kids to see that. I want them to see what it looks like when a person decides they are going to trauma. Elias looked at the note, then at Helen. Then he did something she suspected did not happen often. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. And when he looked back at her, he did not bother to pretend the last 30 seconds had not happened. Okay, he said, roughly. Okay. Helen picked up her coffee. Go tell your people they can come in, she said. Not all at once, but I think I would like to meet a few more of them. And they have been standing out there long enough, she paused. And somebody get those rolls out of the oven before they burn. Bobby would never forgive me. Elias almost smiled. It started at the corner of his mouth and spread slowly. The smile of a man who had not done it easily or often and had learned to again. Yes, ma'am, he said, and pushed off the counter and turned toward the door. Helen picked up the envelope. She opened it. The first page was the proposal. The second page was the operational funding commitment. 3 years fully funded. The number was large enough that her hand tightened involuntarily on the paper. The third page was a letter typed addressed to her, signed by 47 names, writers, foundation staff, former residents of programs Elias had built. She read 3 lines and had to stop. She folded the letter back carefully the way she had folded that note in a cold, dark storeroom 25 years ago, and she put it in the front pocket of her apron. The bakery door opened. The first writer came in and took off his helmet and looked at her with a particular mix of toughness and vulnerability that she was beginning to understand was not a contradiction, but a portrait. This was what a person looked like when they had been through the fire and come out the other side still soft enough to walk into a bakery in a small Pennsylvania town because someone told them the story of a woman who sat down. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "something smells incredible." "Cinnamon rolls," Helen said. "Bobby's recipe." "Sit down. I will get you one." They came in groups of 4 and 5 the way people file into a church when the service has already started. Quietly, with their helmets under their arms, with the particular restraint of large men trying to make themselves smaller out of respect for a space that was not built for them. Helen stood behind the counter, and she put cinnamon rolls on plates, and she poured coffee, and she looked at their faces one after another, and every face was a different story wearing the same jacket. Savannah had come back out from the back room. She had stopped pretending she was not watching and was now standing at the end of the counter, openly, a dish towel in her hands, her eyes moving from face to face with the expression of someone witnessing something they would be describing to people for the rest of their lives. "You doing okay?" Helen asked her quietly, sliding a tray of rolls into the case. "I genuinely do not know," Savannah said. "Should I be taking orders?" "Yes," Helen said. "And do not charge anyone." Savannah looked at her. "Helen, that is like, there are 178. Do not charge anyone, Savannah." Savannah closed her mouth and picked up her order pad and went to work. And she did it with the focused professionalism of a young woman who had been raised right and knew that some moments called for putting your questions away and just being useful. Elias sat at the counter and watched all of it. He drank his coffee and he watched Helen move from the oven to the counter to the tables and back. And the look on his face was something Helen caught twice out of the corner of her eye and both times had to look away from because it was too much. It was the look of a man watching something he had imagined for 25 years happen exactly the way he imagined it. And there is a specific kind of fullness in that expression that is almost painful to witness because it belongs entirely to the person feeling it, and any outside observation of it is a small intrusion. A man named Rye sat down at the counter and told Helen about his son, who was 11, and had a science fair project due Friday, and had been working on it for 3 weeks. The pride in his voice was almost aggressive. It was the pride of a man who knew exactly what the alternative to this moment looked like, and refused to let it go unremarked. He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. A small boy with Rye's exact jawline standing next to a papier-mâché model of the solar system, grinning with a totality that only 11-year-olds can manage. "That is Elijah," Rye said. "He is wonderful." "He is wonderful," Helen said. "He does not know I am here today," Rye said. "He thinks I am at a chapter meeting, which I am technically." The corner of his mouth lifted. "When I get home tonight, I am going to tell him about you, about this place, because he is going to ask where I was, and I am going to tell him the truth. I always tell him the truth." He looked at the photo for a moment before sliding his phone back into his pocket, because that was the first thing Elias told us. Always tell the kids the truth, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. Because kids who grew up like we did, we always knew when adults were lying to us. We always knew. And every lie was a door closing. Helen thought about Danny at the back table telling her about his father. "My dad was not like that. The controlled flatness of it. The door pressed shut. You are a good father, Rice," she said. He looked like he had been handed something he did not know how to hold. "I am working on it," he said. "Every day I am working on it." The bakery was getting loud now. Not chaotic, but alive in a way it had not been in years, maybe ever. The particular loud of people who are happy to be somewhere and are not managing that happiness, just letting it happen. Helen kept moving. She had always worked best in motion. Standing still was where the grief caught her. Moving was where she could outpace it most days. She was pulling a second tray out of the oven when Evelyn appeared at her elbow. "I called Father Donovan," Evelyn said quietly. "He is sending over the church's folding chairs and 3 urns of coffee from the hall. The Brennan family is bringing their van with extra supplies from their restaurant. You have got more people than food." Helen looked at her. Evelyn shrugged with the perfect nonchalance of a woman who had been solving problems in this town for decades. "What, you think I was just going to sit at my table?" She picked up a spatula. "Tell me what needs to come out of the freezer. There is a specific grace in a person who simply sees what needs to be done and does it." Helen had always known Evelyn possessed it. She had just never seen it deployed at this particular scale before. "Back freezer," Helen said. "The 2 sheet pans on the middle shelf." And thank you, Evelyn. Do not thank me, Evelyn said, already moving. Just let me be here for this. The morning stretched on. Helen lost track of the individual faces and let herself stop tracking and just be in it. In the noise and the warmth and the smell of coffee and cinnamon and the way the bakery felt absolutely full for the first time in longer than she could precisely name. Bobby had always said the bakery was supposed to be a place people came to feel held. She had kept that. She had kept it even on the days when keeping it felt like holding a shape in sand, possible only with constant attention and only for a little while. Today it felt like the shape had held on its own. She was at the back counter when Elias found her. "Can I show you something?" he said. He was holding his phone. On the screen was a photograph of a building, brick wide, 3 stories, the windows large and recently replaced, judging by the way they caught the light. There was scaffolding along one side and a dumpster in the front, the unmistakable evidence of active renovation. "That is the Pittsburgh building," he said. Helen took the phone. She looked at the photograph. Then she swiped. The next photo was the interior, the main common area, high ceilings, exposed beams, the floors newly refinished and gleaming in the way of wood that has been properly treated and is ready to be walked on. She swiped again. The kitchen. It was everything Robert had said. Commercial grade, 6 burners across 2 stations, a long prep counter down the center, a double oven on the back wall, and a window above the sink that looked out over a small courtyard. The counters were bare. The shelves were empty. It was a room waiting to become itself. Helen stood there looking at it longer than she intended. She could see herself in that kitchen. She could see the shelves filled the counters, floured the oven lit. She could see a row of young people standing at the prep counter, learning to knead dough, learning to fold and press and wait, learning the patience that bread requires, which is not so different from the patience that people require. "The renovation is 90% done," Elias said. "We are 4 to 6 weeks from opening pending city inspection. We have 12 young people already confirmed for the first cohort, ages 18 to 22, all aging out of or recently out of foster care, all employed or in school within the past year, all with people at the foundation vouching for them." He paused, all waiting. Helen handed his phone back. 12, she said. "First cohort," he said. "We want to run 3 cohorts a year, building to 24 per cohort within 2 years. The kitchen program would be central, 2 mornings a week minimum, ideally 4. Helen was quiet. "What scares you?" Elias said. She looked at him. "What makes you think something scares me?" "Because you have not said yes yet." Fair, she thought. That was fair. She turned back to the counter and straightened a tray that did not need straightening. The small, busy motion of a person organizing their hands because their mind needs a moment. "I am 63 years old," she said. "I know. I have never run a program. I have run a bakery. There is a difference. I know that too. And I do not." She stopped. "I do not know if I am what those kids need. I am a widow who makes cinnamon rolls in a small town. I am not a counselor. I am not a social worker. I do not have credentials." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Helen." She looked at him. "When I walked into this bakery in January of 1999, he said, 'Did you have credentials?'" The tray stopped moving. "You had soup," he said, "and a chair. And the willingness to sit in it across from someone nobody else wanted to sit across from." He paused. "That is the credential. That is the only credential that has ever actually mattered for this work. Everything else we can teach. Everything else we can staff around. But the thing you have had since you were running this counter in the worst year of your life, still feeding people, still showing up, that cannot be hired or trained or approximated." He leaned against the counter. "I have spent 15 years building this foundation, and I have never once stopped looking for someone who had what you have. I have met exactly one other person in my life who had it. His name was Hank, and he is gone, and I miss him every single day." Helen's jaw was tight. She was not going to cry in front of 178 people. She had decided that already, and she intended to honor the decision. "You would have full staff support," Elias said, and he said it more gently now, shifting from the direct to the practical in the way that good persuaders do, landing the emotional truth first and then building the rational scaffolding under it so the person has something to stand on. A co-director who handles operations, a licensed counselor on staff full-time, a case manager for each resident. Your job is the kitchen program and the culture. The intangible thing, the part that makes the difference between a building with services and a place that actually feels like home. And the bakery, Helen said. And the bakery, Elias confirmed without hesitation. Savannah said she would be willing to take on more hours if the pay was right. Her words, not mine. Helen turned slowly and looked across the bakery at Savannah, who was chatting with two riders near the window with the ease of a girl who had never met a stranger in her life, laughing at something one of them had said completely at home in a situation that would have frozen most people solid. You talked to Savannah, Helen said. She came and found me, Elias said, about 20 minutes ago. Said she wanted me to know that she was fully prepared to run this place in Helen's absence if Helen decided to take the job, and that I should make sure you knew that before you used the bakery as a reason to say no. Helen looked at Savannah. Savannah caught Helen's eye across the bakery. She raised her eyebrows in a single clear expression that needed no translation. Helen looked away, but something in her chest shifted. She had been thinking about this all morning ever since Elias had laid the envelope on the table. And she had been thinking about it the way she thought about the hard things, which was carefully and honestly and without letting herself look away from the parts that frightened her. And there were parts that frightened her. The scale of it, the responsibility, the particular weight of being the person a broken kid looks to on their worst day. But then she thought about what it felt like to be that person. She thought about Danny at the back table on his fourth night asking about Bobby's picture, the carefulness in his voice. The way he had said, "My dad was not like that," pressed the feeling down, and she had let him because she had known the way you know things about people when you have been paying attention for a long time, that it needed to stay pressed down until he was ready. And that her job in that moment was not to excavate it, but simply to remain present, available, worth staying near. She could do that. She had been doing that her entire adult life, and she had never once stopped to name it as a skill. Had thought of it only as the minimum a person owed to another person. Had not understood until today, until this room full of people who were here because of it, that it was actually the rarest and most essential thing. She was about to speak when the front door opened and a man she did not recognize walked in. Not a rider, no jacket, no helmet, just a man in a gray coat with a clipboard, looking slightly overwhelmed by what he had walked into. "I am looking for a Helen Calloway," he said. "That is me," Helen said. "I am with the Pittsburgh City Planning and Zoning Office," he said, scanning the room with the expression of a municipal employee who had been prepared for most things and not for this. "I have a co-use permit application here that was filed on behalf of the Greer Foundation for an address on, I am sorry. Is this a bad time?" "It is fine," Helen said. She looked at Elias. Elias did not look guilty exactly. He looked like a man who had planned very carefully and whose plan was now arriving slightly ahead of schedule. "The co-use permit," he said carefully, "is for the commercial kitchen operation at the Pittsburgh building. The application requires a named director of food service operations to be approved by the city before we can open the kitchen for residential program use." He paused. "I filed it 3 weeks ago. I may have filed it with a name already on it." Helen stared at him. In my defense, Elias said, "I was confident." The man with the clipboard looked between them with the expression of a man who has absolutely no idea what he has walked into, but is going to do his job anyway. "Ma'am, if you could just confirm the information on the application and sign the verification form, I can process this same day. We have been told this is somewhat time sensitive." Helen took the clipboard. She read her own name at the top of the application. Director of Food Service Programming, Bobby Calloway Kitchen, Greer Foundation, Community Development Initiative, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Her name in black ink on a form that already existed in a government office before this morning, before she had agreed to anything. She looked at Elias. "You were confident," she said. "Yes, that is either very arrogant or very faithful." "I prefer to think of it as Hank's approach," Elias said. "He used to say, never wait to do the paperwork on something you know is right. The paperwork is an act of faith." Helen looked at the form for a long moment. She thought about Bobby, who had signed the lease on this bakery 2 weeks before the bank approved the loan, because he had told Helen when she panicked that signing it was an act of faith, and the bank would follow the faith, not the other way around. He had been right. The bank came through 5 days later. She thought about a note in careful handwriting at the bottom of a cold cot. She thought about a cedar box on a shelf in the back office. She thought about 12 young people in Pittsburgh who were waiting, who did not know her name yet, who would not know her name until she made a decision, and then drove the 2 hours west and walked into that kitchen and started the ovens. She picked up the pen. She signed her name. The man with the clipboard said, "Thank you, we will process this within 48 hours," and turned around and walked back out through a room of 178 Hell's Angels, who parted for him like water and closed behind him like water, and he disappeared back into the ordinary. Tuesday he had apparently expected this to be. Helen set the clipboard on the counter. The bakery had gone quiet. Not completely. There was still the low murmur of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, Savannah's laugh from somewhere near the window. But the people close to the counter had felt the shift in the room and were watching. Elias was watching. "You knew," she said. "You knew I was going to say yes. I believed you were going to say yes," he said. "There is a difference." "What difference?" "Knowing does not require you," he said. "Believing requires both of us." Helen looked at her own name on the form for a moment. Then she looked up at the bakery, at Evelyn, who was standing near the oven with a spatula and eyes that were distinctly too bright to pretend nothing had happened, at Savannah, who had stopped laughing and was looking at Helen with an expression of complete and uncomplicated love, at the writers spread across every table, coffee in hand, talking and quiet and present in the particular way of people who have driven a long way because something mattered. At Robert sitting alone near the back window, turning his helmet slowly in his hands, watching her with that open face that cost something to maintain and was worth every cent. At the framed photo behind the register, Bobby in his apron laughing, flour on his nose. Helen pressed her hand flat against the counter, the worn-down edge where thousands of people had leaned, where Bobby used to rest his elbows, where she had pressed her forehead on the bad nights. "Okay," she said quietly, not to Elias, not to any particular person. To the room, to the morning, to whatever you call the force that carries things forward when you are not strong enough to carry them yourself, okay? Elias did not say anything. He picked up his coffee cup and held it toward her. She picked up hers. They touched them together over the counter. No ceremony, no speech, just the quiet click of two cups and the smell of cinnamon rolling through a room full of people who were alive on a Tuesday in October, because somebody once decided they were worth the trouble of sitting across from. The last cinnamon roll left the bakery at 12:47 in the afternoon. Helen knew because she counted. She had made 11 batches since 4 in the morning, more than she had ever made in a single day, more than she had made in any week of the pandemic when people were ordering everything they could get their hands on just to feel like something in the world was still normal. She had run out of the bread flour Savannah had restocked on Monday, had borrowed 2 bags from the Brennan family's restaurant supply when their van arrived, had mixed and rolled and glazed until her shoulders ached in the specific way they ached after a day that asked everything of them. She had not stopped once, not for grief, not for doubt, not for the full weight of what she had signed her name to that morning, which was sitting in the front pocket of her apron alongside a folded letter from 47 people, and had been there all day like a second heartbeat. Elias found her in the back room at 1 o'clock, washing the last of the mixing bowls by hand, the way she always did because Bobby had always said industrial dishwashers were fine for plates, but mixing bowls deserved the personal attention. She heard the door, felt his presence in the room before he said anything. The particular quality of stillness that he carried with him, that she was already beginning to recognize as specifically his. "They are getting ready to leave," he said. All of them, all of them." He paused. "They wanted to say goodbye, if that is okay." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had been a boy, who had pressed the feeling down and kept the paper until it fell apart, and driven here from wherever he had started his morning with 177 people behind him, and not looked back once. "It is okay," she said. She followed him out. What happened next was something Helen would spend years trying to describe accurately and never quite manage. There were too many bodies in too small a space. And then they were outside on Archer Street, and there were too many bodies in too large a space. And in both cases, the experience was the same. The overwhelming physical sense of being surrounded by people who meant it, who had shown up in the most literal possible way with their engines and their miles and their Tuesday morning sacrificed to the act of being present for something that mattered. They lined up along the street not formally. No one called them to order or organize the rows. They just gathered the way people gather around something they want to be near. And Helen walked out the front door of her bakery and stood on the sidewalk and looked at them. Someone started clapping. It spread the way fire spreads. One point of ignition and then immediately everywhere. And within 4 seconds, 178 people were applauding on Archer Street in Ridgemont, Pennsylvania. And Helen Calloway stood in the middle of it with her dish towel still over one shoulder and her apron still on and her eyes doing exactly what she had told them all day they were not allowed to do. She let them. She stood there and she let it happen. And she did not press her mouth shut or look at the ceiling or any of the other small mechanics of not crying that she had employed throughout the day. She just stood in it because Bobby had always told her that when people give you something real, the least you can do is receive it fully. And she had not always been good at that, had spent most of her life deflecting and minimizing and saying, I am fine to Evelyn when she was not. But she was going to be good at it right now for Bobby, for Elias, for the boy who had written a careful note and left it under a key on a folding table, for herself. Evelyn was beside her. When had Evelyn gotten beside her, she did not know. But she felt the older woman's hand take hers and squeeze once hard and hold on. And Helen squeezed back just as hard. The applause went on longer than it had any logical reason to. When it stopped, Elias stepped forward. He was facing her, his back to his riders, and he reached into his jacket and took out a small object and held it out to her. It was a key, a single key on a plain metal ring. To the Pittsburgh building, he said. The copy I have been carrying since we bought it. He paused. I was saving it for today. Helen took the key. It was warm from his pocket. She closed her fingers around it. There is something else, Elias said. He turned to his riders. He said a name, Robert, and the young man moved through the group and came forward. And he was carrying something flat and rectangular, wrapped in brown paper, tucked carefully under one arm. Robert stopped in front of Helen. He held out the package. Open it, Elias said. Helen took it. She slid her thumb under the tape and folded the paper back. Inside was a frame. Simple dark wood, the kind of frame that says the thing inside it matters more than the thing holding it. And inside the frame, mounted on cream-colored backing, was the plastic-sealed note. Mrs. Calloway, I do not know how to say thank you for this, so I am just going to say it straight. Except it was not the only thing in the frame. Beside the note, also mounted, was a second piece of paper. Not old, new, white unlined, dated that morning. In Elias's handwriting. The same controlled script of a man who had once been a boy who took care with small things. A single line 25 years later, the answer is, you saved him, you saved all of us. Helen read it twice. She looked up at Elias. He said nothing. He did not need to. She pressed the frame against her chest with both hands, and she held it there. This impossible object that contained 25 years of wondering, and its answer in the same piece of wood. And she felt the morning, all of it, from 4 in the dark to this moment in the October light, move through her like current, invisible and essential, traveling further than you can follow. Robert was watching her with that open face. Thank you, she said. Her voice was rough. We made it last night, he said. Me and Elias and Emmett. We stayed up until 2 in the morning getting the mounting right. He paused. Elias kept saying the angle was off. From behind him, Emmett's voice came. The angle was off. Somewhere in the group, someone laughed. Then someone else. Then it rippled through the whole assembly, quiet and warm. The laughter of people who were happy and not embarrassed about it. And Helen laughed too, a short involuntary sound that she had not planned, but that felt like something releasing that had been held for a very long time. Then Elias said to the group, we ride. The sound that followed was enormous and immediate. Engines turning over one after another, the thunder building back into the full-throated roar that had shaken Helen's pastry case 4 hours ago. Except now she was standing in the middle of it instead of behind glass looking out. And it felt entirely different from the inside. Not frightening, not threatening, alive. She walked back to the sidewalk and stood with Evelyn and Savannah, who had appeared at her other side sometime in the last few minutes, and was filming on her phone with the focused intensity of a 22-year-old who understood that documentation was a form of preservation and that some things deserve to be preserved. "Are you filming this?" Helen asked. "Obviously," Savannah said. "Helen, there are 178 Hell's Angels leaving your bakery after spending 4 hours eating cinnamon rolls and crying. I am absolutely filming this." Helen looked at her. Then she shook her head slowly and looked back at the street. Elias was the last to mount. He paused beside his bike and turned back to her one final time and looked at her across the sidewalk in the small distance between them and all the years that had been in that distance and were now resolved into this. Two people standing in the light of a Tuesday morning that had become something neither of them had words adequate to name. He put his hand to his chest. Once, a gesture so simple and direct that it required nothing added to it. Helen put her hand to hers. He nodded. He mounted his bike, and the last engine in the row turned over and the column of 178 motorcycles pulled out of Archer Street in Ridgemont, Pennsylvania. And when the last one turned the corner and the sound began to fade, Helen stood on the sidewalk and listened to it go until it was gone entirely and Ridgemont was quiet again. The ordinary particular quiet of a small town on a Tuesday, except it was not the same quiet it had been at 4 that morning. Helen could feel the difference even before she understood it. The quiet was different because she was different, and the space a person occupies changes when the person changes even in subtle ways that no one else might notice, and that the person themselves might not be able to articulate precisely, but can feel with complete certainty. She was different. Evelyn squeezed her hand and released it. "I am going to go home and lie down," she announced. "I have had enough feelings for one day, possibly for the entire year." She picked up her purse from where she had apparently placed it on the sidewalk at some point during the morning. "Call me tonight, I will," Helen said. "I mean it. Tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight, Helen." Evelyn walked away with the brisk, purposeful step of a woman who had seen everything and survived it all and intended to continue doing exactly that for as long as possible. Savannah lowered her phone. She looked at Helen with an expression that was trying to be casual and not quite getting there. So Helen said, Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh. Savannah turned the phone over in her hands once. Then she said, "I have been thinking about what I want to do after I finish my associates. I was going to transfer to state for business management." She paused. "But I have been thinking maybe something more applied would be good. Something where the management actually matters because real things depend on it." Another pause. "I do not know. I am just thinking out loud." Helen looked at her. This girl who had her grandmother's laugh and her mother's tendency to text and apparently her own unannounced and entirely formidable courage. "What are you saying?" Savannah shrugged with elaborate casualness. "I am saying that if the bakery needed a full manager and the foundation needed a junior operations coordinator for Pittsburgh who could also do Ridgemont oversight, those are technically two jobs that one person could grow into." She met Helen's eyes. "I am saying I could grow into them." Helen was quiet for a moment. She thought about the way Savannah had moved through the bakery all morning, the efficiency of it, the instinct, the way she had gone from confused to useful in approximately 30 seconds and had never stopped being useful after that, the way she had talked to Elias without being intimidated, the way she had filmed the send-off with a clear-eyed understanding that some things need to be kept. "Come to Pittsburgh with me next week," Helen said. "See the building, meet the staff Elias is putting in place. If you still want to talk about it, after that we will talk about it." Savannah pressed her lips together hard in the way of a person preventing themselves from reacting too quickly. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Yes, next week." She went back inside to finish the closing work, and Helen was alone on the sidewalk. She stood there for a moment, the framed note under her arm, the key in her pocket, the letter from 47 people folded against her ribs. The street was empty. The bakery was quiet. The October light was the particular gold of mid-afternoon, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they have been chosen. She went inside. She walked to the back office. She sat down at Bobby's desk. Still Bobby's desk in her mind. Always Bobby's desk. The surface worn smooth where his forearms had rested. The drawer handle replaced twice, but the scratches on the front panel still there from a dolly that had gone sideways in the hallway in 2004. She set the framed note on the desk in front of her. She looked at Bobby's photo. Not the one behind the register, but the other one. The one she kept back here where it was only for her. The two of them on the day the bakery opened. 1993. She was 30, he was 34, and they were standing in the front doorway with their arms around each other and the sign above them, brand new, the paint, not even fully dry yet. And they were laughing. She did not remember exactly what they were laughing at, but she remembered the feeling of it. The terrified, exhilarated feeling of standing at the beginning of something you were not certain would work, but were absolutely certain was worth trying. She felt that feeling now. I said yes, she said out loud to the photo. She had been doing this for 7 years, talking to Bobby in the quiet of the back office, and she intended to keep doing it for as long as she needed to, which she suspected was the rest of her life, and she did not find it strange or sad. She found it the most natural thing in the world. I said yes to Pittsburgh. I know what you would say. You would say the paperwork was an act of faith. She paused. Elias said that too, actually. Well, he said Hank said it, but it sounded like you. The office was quiet. The afternoon light came through the small window and fell across the desk in a warm rectangle. Bobby, she said, there is a boy out there named Robert. He took your name, she paused. I think you would have liked him. I think you would have looked at him and seen exactly what I saw, which is a kid who decided not to let the hard things close him off. You would have sat across from him and made him feel like he was home, the way you did for everyone. She looked at the frame on the desk, at the two pieces of paper side by side, the one from 1999 and the one from this morning, the question and the answer, the beginning and whatever came after the beginning, which was everything, which was always everything. She picked up the frame and stood. She walked back out to the front of the bakery. She went behind the counter and she looked at the wall beside Bobby's photo, the register photo, the one of him laughing with flour on his nose. She had kept the nail there for years, a small bare nail that had once held a chalkboard special sign she had taken down to repaint and never put back up because she could not figure out what should hang there instead. She hung the frame on the nail. She stepped back. The two photos hung side by side, Bobby laughing and a 17-year-old boy's careful thank you next to a man's answer 25 years later. The beginning and the proof, the seed and what grew from it, the thing you do in the dark with no audience, and what it becomes when it finally finds a light. Savannah came out from the back, looked at the wall, and stopped. She stood there for a moment, dish towel in her hands, looking at what Helen had hung. Then she said quietly, "That is exactly right." Helen looked at it for one more moment. Then she turned around and put her hands on the counter and looked at the bakery. The tables wiped clean, the chairs straight, the case glass still bearing the ghost smudges of a morning that had held more people than the room was built for and held them anyway. She thought about 12 young people in Pittsburgh who were waiting, who did not know yet that the kitchen in their building was about to smell like cinnamon every morning, who did not know yet that someone was coming who knew how to sit down across from a person and make them feel worth sitting across from, who did not know that this was coming for them, the way it had come for Elias, the way it had come for Emmett and Nolan and Warren and Franklin and Robert, the way it travels through people, through years, through the specific and irreplaceable gravity of one human being deciding that another human being is worth their time. They did not know yet, but they were about to find out. Helen Calloway untied her apron, folded it over the counter, and started planning what she was going to teach first. Not the recipe, not the technique, not the measurements or the timing or the particular discipline of bread that Bobby had spent years mastering and she had spent years honoring. First, she was going to teach them what Bobby had always said a kitchen was really for. She was going to teach them that a person who can feed someone else will never again believe they have nothing to offer the world. That was the beginning. That had always been the beginning. And the beginning, it turned out, never stopped.